my world has been at peace. But something is coming. I can feel it. Dark forces are upon us.
After the launch of World of Warcraft in 2005, the Warcraft franchise became one of the most popular video game properties of all time, permeating mainstream culture with its immersive world and extensive lore that allowed people all over the world to practically live within its fantasy universe. A film version of Warcraft was announced the following year in 2006, with a 2009 release date in mind. Sam Raimi, the director behind the Evil Dead franchise and the extremely successful Spider-Man movies, was initially attached to direct the film. However, after creative disagreements with Blizzard Entertainment, the company that owned the Warcraft franchise, Raimi left the project and the film was still considered to be in development as late as 2011, 5 years after it was announced. New life was breathed into the film version of Warcraft in 2013 when director Duncan Jones came aboard the production. Jones, the son of singer David Bowie, was riding high off the success of his previous films Moon and Source Code, with Warcraft slated to be his biggest and most ambitious film to date. Warcraft was released over the summer of 2016, and while die-hard fans of the video game seemed to embrace the film, the feature film version of Warcraft failed to connect with audiences. With a budget of $160 million, The Hollywood Reporter claimed that the film needed to earn at least $450 million just to break even. Warcraft grossed a mere $47 million in the United States, with its worldwide box office bringing its total to $433 million, about $17 million shy of that break-even mark. Though Warcraft failed to connect with US audiences, it was one of the most anticipated films of all time in China, where the film had the widest release ever in that country, occupying an unprecedented 67% of all theater screens. Fans of the video game made up 85% of total attendees during its opening weekend, and the film went on to gross $221 million in China, the highest grossing Hollywood film ever to be released in that country, effectively saving the film from being considered an unmitigated bomb by the industry. Because of its disappointing performance at the box office, plans for further entries in the movie franchise have been scrapped, with director Duncan Jones saying in 2018 that the chance of a sequel happening was not good. In this episode of Roundtable Reviews, we take a look at the story of the film, discuss what the movie did right and wrong, and analyze why such a popular video game franchise failed to connect with movie audiences. So choose your faction, hop onto your mounts, and prepare to level up as we take a deep dive into the movie version of Warcraft. Hey everyone, how's it going? Matthew Kadish here, author, evil genius, and level 100 paladin. Coming at you today with another roundtable review, this time for the epic fantasy adaptation known as Warcraft. Yes, the video game that took the world by storm, got its own movie, and today we're going to talk about it. And I have the pleasure of having two very special guests who are what I would consider Warcraft experts on the roundtable review today. And the first guest I'd like to introduce you to is a man who is single-handedly responsible for me spending thousands of dollars in Hearthstone. The one and only Kripparrian. So, Krip, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone out there?
Hey guys, Kripparrian here. I've been playing Blizzard games since I've been like 7. I actually think I started with Warcraft 1, so here we are, right? Yeah, just love me some Warcraft. I love the fantasy genre, but particularly, the sword and board and a few spells. Warcraft just hits it just right. And I've been playing every Warcrafty game Blizzard's done for, what has it been now, 25 years? Yeah, and here we go. And obviously I've seen the movie and all the rest, so we can talk about it some.
Well, Krip's being a little bit modest. He was one of the top World of Warcraft players. I believe you were in a top guild as well.
Yep.
And he's also one of the preeminent Hearthstone players out there. So if you haven't seen his channel, hours and hours of entertainment on there. I'd highly recommend you guys check him out on YouTube. Now, another great YouTube Warcraft expert that we've got for today's review is Nobbel, Nobbel87, is that correct? Yeah. In terms of the YouTube channel. Now, Nobbel happens to be one of the best Warcraft lore YouTubers that I've found. And I've learned way more by watching his videos than I actually have been playing the Warcraft games. So, Nobbel, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. Well, I'm Nobbel, and I'm completely overshadowed here. I'm sitting next to a legend that's just been playing every Warcraft game. For me, the adventure started with Classic, and slowly but surely, I built up a channel on YouTube where I discuss the lore behind Warcraft. So, a few years now, I've been busy with trying to dive into what characters, what backgrounds, what zones. Sometimes dabbling into Hearthstone as well. And of course, I've also seen the Warcraft movie, yeah, twice now. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I saw it once in the theater and a couple times on video, especially in preparation for this roundtable review. So why don't we get right to it? So what I wanted to start off with is ask each of you, I know that you both did reviews on your channels when the Warcraft movie came out a couple years ago. So what I wanted to ask you, just for everyone's, kind of orient themselves in terms of how you stand on the movie, what did you personally think of the Warcraft film, and did you think it was a good movie or a bad movie, and if so, why? So, Krip, why don't we start with you?
I really like the Warcraft movie. I think as a movie for the culture that's into this type of fantasy, that's into Blizzard games, that's ever played World of Warcraft, I think the movie just kills it. And I think, I ended up seeing, I think, it 3 times. The third time I saw it was at a Hearthstone event, and there was a bunch of Blizzard employees, and they just had the movie in the background while people watched it or socialized, and I was editing videos with my wife at the time. So it just feels kind of wholesome in a way for our culture. Now, I kind of understand there's a little bit of a difference between people like me and people that watch, whatever else and live a different type of life. And I don't know where the movie hits for those people. I'm kind of surrounded by like-minded people like myself. And I think speaking on behalf of us super fans in a way, I was very pleased with the movie. I think it starts off in a way that really surprises the viewer in terms of the graphics, the visuals. You kind of get many notions of the stories. They name drop just right, but they don't overdo it. I have very, very few things to say badly about the movie, but I understand that is from the super fan part of it. As for the others, well, maybe you guys can shed some light.
Well, Nobbel, why don't you shed some light on what you personally thought of the movie and whether you thought it was good or bad and why that is?
Well, I'm also a big fan of Warcraft, but I remember leaving the theater the first time that I saw it with confusion, which then was settled in with a bit of a meh feeling. I will agree, the way that they brought the universe to life has been fantastic. My only expectation going into this movie was I just want to see Warcraft on the big screen. And in that regard, they nailed it. But when it comes to the movie itself, character development, pacing, everything else, there were definitely some things that made me scratch my head and be like, what was going on? What kind of story were they trying to tell? So for me, I also rewatched my review that I did immediately after the theater. The opinion has kind of stayed the same, even after watching it for the second time. I would, a 6 or a 7 would it be for me? Yeah.
Well, it's funny because I went and saw Warcraft in the theater when I was vacationing in Austin, Texas, with my girlfriend. And I'm kind of a casual Warcraft fan. I played Warcraft 2 and 3, and I played World of Warcraft when it first came out for about 6 months or so, and then I kind of lost interest and moved on. So I only had a tangential kind of understanding of Warcraft and the lore. And by the time I saw the movie, I'd probably forgotten most of it. But my girlfriend just was a complete blank slate. She didn't know anything about Warcraft. And she found the movie incredibly boring. And I found it kind of in tune with Nobbel's take, which was I just felt it was kind of meh. It was just a decent movie, but it wasn't something that I was like, oh, I got to go see this again and again and again. So I think that it is kind of interesting how the average audience who maybe doesn't know much about Warcraft viewed the movie versus the people who are super fans and really liked it, because one of the interesting things that we're going to talk about later on is that they really geared the movie toward people who are super fans of Warcraft. So, but what I want to talk about now is an interesting thing about the Warcraft movie is that it can be considered an adaptation. Basically, you're adapting a video game to a movie. But one of the interesting things about this adaptation is that the source material for it is way beyond video games. Like there's books, there's guides, there's all types of stuff that kind of expands upon the lore of the world of Warcraft. And other video game adaptations like Assassin's Creed, Need for Speed, Hitman Agent 47, and Tomb Raider, all of which kind of came out around the same time as the Warcraft movie, they've all been considered failures. And even though World of Warcraft made $433 million worldwide, its domestic box office in the US was only like $47 million, and that was on a $160 million budget. So by that standard, it was considered a failure, at least by Hollywood standards. But I wanted to ask you guys, in your opinion, why do you think video games are so hard to successfully adapt into movies that people, especially fans of the game, end up enjoying? So, Krip, what do you think about that?
It's a tough question because we have a very biased side to this. As a super fan, just I watch every single like video game related movie. I watch every single like Marvel movie, every single like Star Wars movie, even the just little dazzle of sci-fi. If they leave the romance out, man, it's perfect, right? So it's pretty difficult to call it. I just know that a lot of people don't get like that hyped to see these movies, and you can tell that in the reviews. Like if you've seen any one of the movies that I mentioned, the IMDb reviews, they come in and they're all like, "This is the best movie ever." It hits that landslide where every single one of these movies in the first few days starts off really high, and as the days go by, as the weeks go by, you just see that rating go down and down and down and down and down and down. And rarely do these movies ever make it over like a 7 out of 10. And when they do, I think it's typically because of like the humor involved. If anything, I feel like maybe the Warcraft movie didn't incorporate a lot of those very generic reasons why people watch these movies that you see a lot of similar movies adapt these days. Like if you've seen the Marvel movies over the last 20 years, they incorporate more and more just, funny moments throughout, just kind of jokes. So people who aren't like, lavishing the lore and the interpretation of the characters, they just get something out of it. And it's something they can tell their friends. It's something they can talk about. It's something that, they can maybe watch it a second time. And I think in that regard, perhaps a lot of these video game movies don't really have that focus as they should. So maybe that's an aspect.
Noble, why do you think video games are so hard to adapt into movies?
I liked your question actually, because the first time that I read it, I was like, I'm going to bring out Uwe Boll and I'm going to say like money laundering for taxes. But the titles that you actually mentioned did not involve him.
Yeah. We don't talk about Uwe Boll here. Okay.
Exactly. So in general, it might have to do with you have an audience that enjoys playing video games, but to convert that audience into go watching your movie is perhaps too difficult. In the case of the Warcraft movie, I remember that reviewers were very harsh on it. Perhaps too harsh in the case for what they were going for. Because I remember that just a lot of people were really negative about it and was like, why? It's not as bad as you try to sell it here. But yeah, it's difficult to convert your audience that's used to one thing, because most people play video games for the enjoyment of their character progressing through the world, their character being the hero, instead of watching a movie that just tells the story as it is. And I think that might be the reason why it's so difficult to bring people into the theater to actually watch their movies, as well as the reputation has been built up. Like a lot of video game adaptations, like going as far back as the Super Mario Brothers, they don't have such a good reputation to go to and actually watch the movie and enjoy the movie. It's nice to see your favorite video game character on screen, but there needs to be more substance around it to actually bring people in there.
That's a really good point, in the sense that when it comes to video games, there's two different things that I think propel a movie adaptation. One is the video game has a really good story that kind of sucks the players in and really gets them involved. And then the other one is just there's a character in a video game that audiences, for whatever reason, seem to gravitate towards. And I think that the adaptations for like the character-centric video games are a little bit harder to do, in the sense that, you know, basically like a platformer, like for instance, you know, Tomb Raider, you know, you're playing as Lara Croft, and the fun is basically figuring out these puzzles and platforming. The same thing with Uncharted, you know, when you're playing as Nathan Drake. And so as a movie, you kind of have to take that character and put them in like an interesting plot. And sometimes that can be difficult to do, because we had how many like Tomb Raiders, like 3 of them, the 2 with Angelina Jolie and then this newer one. And all 3 of them kind of fell flat on their face, despite the fact that I feel like the main character was really well cast, and you know, it was kind of, you know, an engaging character that people wanted to see more of, but the plot kind of let them down. And then you have a situation where you have games like, for instance, Warcraft. All the Warcraft games had fantastic plots to them. Like, you know, you go through the story and, you know, you're into it, but there's either no central character that you can really latch on to, or there are like lots of different characters and like too many to latch on to. And, you know, I think that that's another problem, is that when you're adapting a movie from a video game, you can't just take the story from the game and plop it up on screen, because the story is, you know, video game, it's a different medium to tell that story with. So you kind of have to, you know, make changes that the people who played the game might not like, which I think was probably one of the pitfalls that Warcraft fell into, because they did make some fairly controversial changes, which we're going to talk about. So let's talk about them. The producers and the director of the Warcraft film basically claim that they made this movie for the fans. Okay, so we know that Duncan Jones was a big World of Warcraft player, and when he came on board, he kind of tailored the movie to be more in line with, you know, the Crip crowd, where, you know, the super fans. So do you think that catering so narrowly to the Warcraft fans may have left the more general audiences who weren't as familiar with the Warcraft mythos out in the cold? Or did you think it was a wise decision to offer so much fan service in the film? And additionally, how do you think writers should strike a balance between the two? Krip, what do you think about that?
So I touched upon this in my last answer a little bit, where I think it's pretty clear that they did try to go after the super fans, but I think they could have taken a page out of, like, you know, Disney's book, and just, you know, go with a lot more moments that are, you know, much more general to the crowd. I can't say I particularly like them, but a joke here, a joke there, I think can do a lot for the general audience. But also on that note, they did change quite a bit of the lore in the movie versus Warcraft. And, you know, I don't really mind that much, but I think a lot of people who are super fans of the Warcraft genre do mind a lot about that. So even though they kind of say that they went for a movie for the fans, they kind of divided them even further, changing up the story and, you know, relationships between the characters in several ways. And I think maybe that was one of the crucial mistakes, because I feel when you really nail a movie down with the fans, they get their friends in the theater. But I think the second division maybe was a bit of a catastrophic one for most people. I didn't really mind that much. A few changes of lore for me is kind of expected in the theaters.
Well, Krip, how do you think that affected kind of general audiences who maybe went into the movie not knowing anything about, you know, the Warcraft lore? Like my girlfriend, for instance, because like she just kind of, I think, felt lost throughout most of the movie, because there were some times where I felt like the movie expected you to know certain things about Warcraft, and if you weren't kind of plugged into the Warcraft mythos beforehand, you were kind of just confused.
It depends what the expectations are of people who go into these movies without knowing any of the lore. I think in terms of, these guys are clearly the bad guys, these other guys are clearly the good guys, and then we kind of see, you know, kind of relationships develop. Yeah, you don't know the characters, but I don't know. Maybe more patience needs to be exercised when you go blind into a movie like this. I don't know. It's tough to really put all of the Warcraft lore out there in one movie. Surely, if they did it across like 2 or 3 different movies, these themes could have been much more smoothed out for people who haven't encountered them before. But I think their goal was one movie. They want to tell a story, and to do that, there's got to be a number of fairly expected shortcuts.
Now, Noble, you're the lore expert here. So what I want to ask you is, do you think it was a wise decision to kind of cater to those fans, even though they were changing the lore up a little bit? Or do you think they maybe should have pulled that back a bit and tried to, be more inclusive to the general audience?
I think it's difficult to say. Like, you can tell that they want to tell a story. And for those unaware, the lore of the Warcraft movie has been changed so much that you need to see it as an alternate reality. It does not affect the lore as it is in the game. That's how much it's changed, basically. They got new books, new comics out to support the story in the movie. And to the general audience, I imagine if you sit there and you're told that's King Lane and that's Lothar, those are the heroes, and that's Durotan, I kind of imagine that you can follow the plot line, like the green orcs bad, brown orcs good, and those are the humans. I imagine you can follow that, and then it just becomes a basic fighting movie. If that's enjoyable, that's entirely up to you. But was it a good decision? Maybe. On the other hand, like you mentioned before, this movie should have been done in multiple parts. Like, pacing is a big problem. And they should have spent way more time explaining, this is the homeworld of the orcs, this is the homeworld of the humans, now they clash. A 3-parter. And it does seem to me like I'm not sure if they were actually planning to just make one movie, because it is titled The Beginning. So you kind of expect that from the beginning, we're going to go to the middle, and then we're going to go to the end. But on the other hand, to deep dive into a trilogy with a movie, with something based off a video game, is a big risk to take. Like Lord of the Rings does it, but that was a big risk on its own. Imagine doing something like that for a video game. So at that part, I would just say maybe it would have been best to just focus on the orcs for a while and see how that will work up to the point where they were ready to go through the Dark Portal, and then maybe bring the humans in, and then maybe do the next one. Maybe that would have been a better development.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned Lord of the Rings, because that is kind of the gold standard of fantasy movie adaptations. And I felt like that was a good model that Warcraft could have followed, especially like if you look at Fellowship of the Ring, they spend the opening of that movie kind of laying out, okay, this is the world, this is the history, this is what happened. And it gives you a really good kind of, groundwork with which to go and view the other things that happen in that movie. And, we get a little prelude in the Warcraft film where it briefly talks about humans versus orcs, but it doesn't really expand upon, like what's the setting, who are the different factions, what's a little bit of the history of this. It really just kind of glosses over, like, okay, humans have been fighting orcs for this amount of time, and now we're going to show you why, and just gets right into the story. Now, in terms of the adaptation, like you mentioned how there were so many changes made that the movie is basically an alternate reality to the video games. So like when you are adapting a movie, certain changes have to be made for the sake of translating the original work into a film. So I don't hold it against filmmakers who make changes when adapting stuff. But in Warcraft's case, they really took a lot of liberties with the lore. And what I want to ask you guys is, what do you feel are the worst changes made for the sake of the movie adaptation? And why do you think they were made? But for more than that, how do you think they could have been handled differently? So, Noble, why don't we start with you?
When it comes to the changes, the one that I find the strangest, not so much the worst, but the strangest would be the relationship between Garona and Medivh. The movie does not do a fantastic job at explaining this, and according to Duncan Jones on Twitter, that's because it's been cut up. But apparently in the Warcraft movie universe, Medivh is actually Garona's father, whereas in the original universe, she was his lover. And I was like, that's an interesting change. Whereas the worst change, in my opinion, is Elodie. The background behind that in the original story is that Elodie is the first Guardian, and from that moment on, the Guardian's power has been passed on. Then you have the subplot of Aegwynn and Sargeras and Medivh becoming corrupted. Whereas in the Warcraft movie, they got Elodie, which is some kind of spirit goop in a cube, apparently corrupted by Fel somehow, Apparently, that's the reason why Medivh is corrupted somehow, but it's never been explained what exactly Elodie is. And then they got some catchphrase about light and darkness and light.
Always remember, from light comes darkness, and from darkness,
that's going to be your climactic moment. And I'm like, it doesn't make any sense. What's going on here? So I don't really get why they had to change the whole Elodie storyline. I understand that it's hard to explain the whole history of Sargeras and the Pantheon and how Medivh became corrupted. But then just cut it all out and say, like, yeah, Medivh is corrupted. The end. Like, why do you have to make the whole Elodie bit in there? That, for me, would be the worst change.
I definitely felt like that line, from light comes darkness and from darkness comes light. I was like, that's not how light and dark work, really. In there. So a little bit of a weak writing line there. But it is interesting because I know that, at least in the Warcraft lore, the female spirit that you talked about in the movie, what was her name? Elodie,
yeah.
Elodie. So she kind of faced off with the Warcraft's big bad Sargeras, who's like this evil titan that is responsible for all the demons and the Burning Legion and stuff like that. And she saved Azeroth from him, but he, in his defeat, he kind of infected her, which in turn infected her son Medivh, which allowed Sargeras to kind of control him and bring the orcs into Azeroth to basically help his Burning Legion get a foothold in the door there. And that's a lot of backstory that didn't necessarily need to be in the movie, but the fact that they kind of glossed over like Sargeras as the big bad, and like you never really knew who that who the female character was in the movie, because they never really bothered to explain it. It was just like very general, and it felt kind of shoehorned in there. And it is interesting that you talked about the movie being cut up, because from what I understand, at least 40 minutes were cut out of this movie. And I think you can tell with some of the editing choices in the film, because it gets really choppy at certain points. Kripp, what do you think were the biggest adaptation changes that the movie made, and did you agree with them or not?
For me, I kind of expected the epic battles to go a little bit differently. Like, if they change the relationship of one character or whatever, I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever, okay, fine. But I kind of expected like the throwdown to be more like magic themed. Like, I didn't expect the ending to be Medivh is just somehow a demon. He's never been a demon before, as far as I know. He's just a big demon. I'm like, oh, okay. And, then there's like golems, but they don't really look like any kind of golems that I've seen Medivh deal with. Like, they weren't even like Karazhan golems. It was like a mud golem. So I don't know. And then they just battle the golem. And I'm like, well, okay, I guess the golem is there, but like I thought it'd be like, oh, I'm gonna cast a bunch of spells, and Medivh's like, oh, I'm gonna cast a bunch of different spells, and then there's like, oh, well, I'm the sword dude, I can like defend you from these things while you cast a bunch of spells and stuff. I thought it'd be like more Warcrafty, at least on obviously that wasn't like the climax of the movie, but I thought that was a pretty relevant part that I kind of expected to go a little differently.
You thought it would be like a raid.
Yeah.
You got the tank, the healer.
There you go.
The DPS. That would have been interesting. The funny thing is that in established Warcraft lore, the battle with Medivh, it took place with Khadgar, I believe, Lothar, and Garona. Garona was actually there when they had the showdown with Medivh. And it was interesting because they were kind of splitting up in the movie the battle over the portal against the battle with Medivh. And I feel like maybe they should have chosen to focus just on the battle with Medivh, at least, partially, because at least from what I understand in Warcraft lore, that was a really interesting fight, because you did get to see Sargeras kind of make an appearance before they were able to kill Medivh, and that was kind of Medivh's plan all along, was to surround himself with these people that he could count on to help defeat this demon that he was battling inside of him. So, Kripp, do you think that there were any other kind of changes to the lore that were a bit?
Well, there were a lot of changes to the lore. I'm just kind of giving my side of this. I just thought, some of the ways that the events concluded could have been different, because that's kind of what you're left with. At least that's kind of what I'm left with when I see, one of these plots. But yeah, as it's been mentioned, a lot of the relationships between the different characters was changed quite significantly, especially in ways that kind of contradict one another. But I didn't really mind that as much. But I might be in the minority where I'm a super fan, but like whatever, just let them rewrite some parts. I don't care that much in that regard, at least.
The thing that gets me is that there's so much really well-defined, well thought out, and well-crafted stories and lore and source material with which these filmmakers had to go off of, and the changes they made just in a way kind of cheapen the source material, because the source material was so good. When you're adapting something as a writer, you just think, well, if this is good, I'm just going to take this and put it on the screen, as opposed to, well, I'm going to take this, I'm going to mix it around and throw it up against the wall and see if audiences like it. So, Nobbel, how do you think that was handled in the movie? Because it does seem like they had really strong source material that they ignored and changed for no reason.
Yeah, there have been quite a few changes in there. And I think that falls back to the original question, like trying to make it more appealing for a general audience, because it's a lot easier to understand for anybody going to the theater that the guys using the fel, the green stuff, those are the bad guys, rather than there's this complicated, intricate story with Sargeras infiltrating the Guardian and try to explain who the Guardian is and what his role is to Stormwind and the humans. So in the regard of the change, like a lot of people expected me to be upset about it as well, that I was sitting in the theaters, like that's not accurate. But the moment that they established, like, this is an alternate reality, I didn't mind anymore. They could do really whatever they wanted to do with the storyline, as long as it was a fun storyline to watch. And you mentioned having more of a climax on Medivh. Yeah, the original battle was really, really cool. He drained like the youth out of Khadgar, and he messed with Garona's mind, and then Lothar came in and he chopped off his head, and Sargeras trying to come out. I don't even know if they actually had the Sargeras storyline in the Warcraft movie, because never has he been mentioned. Yeah, we see some kind of demon coming out, but that could be any old demon.
Yeah, they never really bothered to kind of establish the overarching big baddie. It's just kind of implied that, Medivh got corrupted somehow and the demon got channeled through him. So I think a lot of these changes can be laid at the feet of writer and director Duncan Jones, who basically took over the film after Sam Raimi left. And he made the call to basically elevate the orc Durotan. I don't know. I don't remember how to pronounce it, but basically raise him up to equal standing as a character and spending equal time between the humans and the orcs in the movie. And this was a change that Blizzard was really like 100% behind, because they liked how it reflected the duality of the games. If anyone's ever played the Warcraft games, you know that they're split between humans and orcs, and you kind of get, both sides of the story there. However, in doing so, this created a fundamental problem in the film, with it lacking a central character to empathize with and rally behind, because you have two separate characters now, Durotan and Anduin, and they're competing for both screen time and audience emotional investment. So what I want to know from you guys is, do you think it would have been better to have the movie focus on one of the characters and allow the sequel to explore the other side of it? Or do you think it was the right call to attempt to split the narrative between these two characters? Nobbel, what do you think?
Well, it falls down to the idea of, are we going with the idea of a sequel, right? Again, big risk to invest in that. If we know for certain there are going to be 2 or 3 movies, then I would 100% say focus on one first and then the other. But in the situation that we have, the Warcraft movie that we got, I don't think it's been a bad idea that they focused on Durotan. Like, I personally thought that Durotan and the Orcs were one of the better characters, and I felt that Lothar was one of the better characters. For me, when it comes to the characters that we saw on screen, it was the side characters that needed more development and more time. Not so much these 2 heroes they were focusing on. In my opinion, they were quite there.
Krip, what do you think? Do you think it was the right call to have 2 different main characters and 2 different stories in this movie, or should it have been a bit more streamlined?
Yeah, you mentioned should it be a bit more streamlined. Again, I go to all of these type of movies, superhero movies, fantasy movies, all the like. And obviously I go with Rania, my wife and business partner. And she has the same comments like on most of these. Like, yeah, one good guy, one bad guy gets wrecked, whatever. All right, good guy some way, maybe slightly differently, manages to overcome the challenges to beat the bad guy, right? I think the reason that this idea was so backed up by Blizzard is probably because they've also seen a lot of these movies, and they know a lot of them follow a very traditional path. So, you know, kind of finding a difference that not just works for whatever reason, it works because in Warcraft, there's the Horde and there's the Alliance, there's Orcs and there's humans. I think it's a pretty good call. I would certainly expect them to do it that way, at least in this particular case.
As I worked in Hollywood very briefly, as a screenwriter, as a director, as like a somewhat producer. I wouldn't call myself a producer, but I did do some producing duties while I was in that industry. And when it comes down to movies like this, you can't count on a sequel. So Nobbel's right in that regard, where Blizzard probably wasn't back there. It's like, oh, we're banking on like a 3-movie deal or what have you. But at the same time, you can kind of plan to be like, well, we know that this is a potential franchise, so we can plan at least 3 movies out and look at it like this. I always think that it's better to kind of start a potential franchise going the kind of formulaic, safe route, at least from the filmmaking perspective, in the sense that, you keep it simple, you bring people into the world, you highlight the really cool stuff, and then once that's hit, once you've connected with audiences, the follow-up, you can start taking chances and you can start doing different things. Like, I think it would have been a better strategy to maybe focus on the humans, since they're kind of like easier to connect with in terms of general audiences for the first movie. And then in the plan for the sequel to be like, okay, well, now we're going to shift things and we're going to show things from the Orcs perspective for Warcraft 2. And then in maybe the third movie, we can do like the split narrative type thing. And I think that probably might have been a better strategy, considering that this one didn't seem to work out too well for the first Warcraft movie. But one of my big personal complaints about Warcraft was that it felt like it was trying to do way too much in way too little amount of time. Like we already talked about, there were about 40 minutes cut from this movie, and so that would have put it close to 3 hours long in terms of length. So not only was it trying to tell this tale from the perspective of both races, but it was also mixing major storylines together, such as Medivh's betrayal, Gul'dan's corruption of the Orcs, the invasion of Azeroth, Anduin's subplot with his son, as well as his romance with Garona, and all that stuff. Like, it just seemed like it was packed with like a billion different subplots. So how do you think the movie could have been simplified to make the narrative a little bit stronger? Krip, what do you think?
I mean, you always run the risk here. I mean, we just talked about how they left out a lot of different aspects. We just talked about how they left up, Sargeras. It's such a challenge for them to appease everyone, right? They either go in the direction of actually telling the story in every detail and every character involved and explaining everything somehow magically within the time frame of a typical movie, or they leave stuff out and then, we can focus on the stuff that they leave out. Or, they leave too much stuff out, or they still leave too much stuff in. It's certainly, I think, a moment where you have to kind of respect the challenge that they were given to just create a 2-hour some piece that reflects somewhat adequately what Warcraft is and the main characters involved. In terms of cutting some stuff out, I don't know. It's pretty hard. Like, what would I cut out? I'd probably cut out a lot of the Garona stuff, because it feels like the way that she was included wasn't even that consistent with the lore anyway. So, yeah. But that's kind of my take on it. I like to see badass dudes fight other badass dudes, not so much of the, romance behind the scenes. So, yeah, that's just one person's perspective at the end of the day.
What do you think could have been cut out to streamline the movie a little bit more, Nobbel?
I find it a really difficult question, because, like you mentioned, they could have made a Warcraft movie that focused on the humans. But when it comes to, already we have a niche audience, video game players trying to get to the movies, and then you're also alienating an audience that is Warcraft, between Horde and Alliance. You might have like half your audience saying like, it's an Alliance movie, I don't care. It's a Horde movie, I don't care. So in that regard, respect that they actually tried to bring so much into the movie. To me, it didn't feel right. And when it comes to cutting out, like when it comes to Garona, I think that is indeed one of the characters that stands out, as in, could we cut her out? And when it comes to the original storyline, she played a critical role in the whole uncovering that Medivh is corrupted, a bond with Khadgar, building up an alliance with the humans, until the eventual death of the king. Whereas in this movie, she gets a romance and she sniffs the throne of Stormwind for a little bit, and she kind of shows up. But I do understand her importance as a character. She's basically the bridge between the orcs and the humans in a time where they don't speak each other's languages. And they needed somebody to be in the middle of that and to be that spokesperson for them, to cover those bridges. So perhaps a bit more with Garona, but then if you cut out the Garona romance, you also cut out that moment at the end where the king gets stabbed by Garona, and Lothar is like, oh, she killed the king. And Khadgar's like, I don't believe that. So in a sequel, where then there's going to be conflict, and is Garona the bad guy or not? She's trying to bring peace between the Alliance and the Horde. That kind of felt like they were trying to push in there, trying to build up between her, Lothar, Khadgar, and the rest of the Horde. So I think that's what her role has been. So to just cut her out, I don't know if that would have made, with the direction that they were going with, I don't know if that would have made a lot of sense.
I actually agree with both of you in the sense that I think Garona's kind of through line through the film is the one that's the most expendable. Like, if you're looking at it strictly from a writing perspective, everything that she does in the movie could have been handled by a different character that was already established in there. The romance that she had with Anduin was really weak. I felt like it was very forced. In the lore, in the established source material, Garona and Khadgar kind of they bond over this battle experience they had, where they kind of realize that they can trust one another, and they become allies and somewhat friends, and that eventually leads to them teaming up to defeat Medivh. And we never get that in the Warcraft movie. She's basically, Garona's captured, and all of a sudden Anduin and Khadgar are both like, oh, she's cool, she's one of us. And so they're very surprised when she kills the king at the end, because they're like, well, why did she do that? I thought she was one of our members, but she never really earns that status in the movie. And so I feel like King Lane could have ended up being killed by the Black Hand or Doomhammer or some other orc, and you would have probably had the same climax with Anduin facing down with this orc that killed both his son and his king, or something like that. And it might have made more sense to have that be more than a 2-second fight at the end there. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. What do you think about that, Krip? Did you like the 2-second battle?
Kind of, because you wouldn't expect them to go toe to toe. You'd expect some cheating.
Well, and Noble, correct me if I'm wrong, at least in the Warcraft lore, there was a big battle between Lothar and Doomhammer, where Doomhammer eventually killed Lothar, but Lothar was kind of known for being one of the few soldiers that could stand toe to toe with an orc, right?
There's no battle between Black Hand and Lothar, as far as I remember. In the original lore, we have Orgrim Doomhammer, who in the Warcraft movie is a Frostwolf. In the original one, he is part of Black Hand's clan. And he is the one who challenges his war chief, because he understands there's like corruption in the clan. And basically it's just a mention, like he challenged him for the title of war chief and he won, and he routed out the corruption within the Horde. So getting your balls cut off and then stabbed is kind of a bigger glory than Black Hand got than actually in the lore established. But to your question, I actually wanted to ask, like you mentioned that anybody could have taken over the role of Garona, but who would you appoint then to be the translator? Because she was the one who could pick up languages that easily.
Well, my question to you would be, did they really need a translator? At what point in the movie, like you had the meeting between Durotan and the king, but that could have been, something that was easily taken out of the narrative, in the sense that, the orcs and the humans were obviously, antagonists to one another. So I would have just left the whole like Durotan trying to make peace with the humans thing out of the plot entirely, because you didn't really need, a bridge between the two for this film. Now, I think that in the established source material where Garona is kind of trying to make that bridge there. She's indispensable in that sense. But in the movie, she's just kind of relegated to this kind of background figure, or at the very least, just have like the orcs somehow know how to speak, human, or have Khadgar get, some knowledge about how to translate for orcs for them or whatever. You didn't need Garona. And as a writer adapting this stuff, obviously you want to try to stay as close to the source material as possible. But at the same time, you can make these allowances for the sake of a more streamlined movie. I think if the movie had kept in the extra 40 minutes that it had to cut out, this might have been a smoother subplot for Garona. But of course, unless a director's cut comes out, we're not going to know about that.
Yeah, it also falls in line with trying to build up a relationship between Garona and Medivh in a different matter. And in the source material, there was no real attempt between Durotan and the king to actually establish peace. Durotan and his clan was just exiled, and they were just taken out of the picture.
Yeah, it didn't make a whole lot of sense in the movie either that Durotan would risk so much to try to make peace with the humans. It seemed like his thing was more about, getting rid of what's the evil sorcerer's name again?
Gul'dan, yeah.
Gul'dan, yes. I should know that. I play Hearthstone enough to have known that name. But so basically I think that, you could have easily just had the orcs dealing with their own stuff and the humans dealing with their own stuff and then showing them clashing together, as opposed to trying to have the bridge that Garona was meant to be. I think most of Garona's stuff was just so they could force in a romance storyline between her and Lothar in there, which I didn't really understand. But one of the real brilliant aspects of the Warcraft games is that they show heroes on both sides of the Horde and the Alliance, and there isn't really a clear-cut good versus evil struggle when it comes to the humans versus the orcs. The original Warcraft script that was kind of developed by Sam Raimi was initially a story where the humans were clearly the good guys and the orcs were very clearly the bad guys. But after spending a year or so doing that, Blizzard kind of vetoed this concept that Raimi had, and ultimately went along with Duncan Jones's take on showing both sides as being sympathetic. Kripp, I know in your review for the Warcraft movie on your channel, you talked about how the movie was originally announced in 2006, and then 2007, 2008, and it just kind of, you were like, when's this movie coming out? I don't know if it's ever going to come out. And part of that was because Sam Raimi was kind of fighting with Blizzard over the fact of, how they wanted to tell the story. And eventually Blizzard was like, we don't want to work with Sam Raimi anymore. So they both kind of parted ways. And then Duncan Jones came in and did his pitch, and Blizzard was like, yes, that's the guy we want to go with. And so basically Duncan Jones's concept was very different from Raimi's, where Raimi was a little bit more traditional in the sense like humans good, orcs bad. We're going to have the humans fighting the orcs. And Jones comes in and is like, no, we're going to do both sides of the tale. And Blizzard was totally behind that. So do you think that the decision to try to show sympathetic portrayals of both humans and orcs was the right way to go? I know you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to know, would the movie have been better, in your opinion, with the more traditional take that Sam Raimi was kind of pushing for? What do you think, Kripp?
Well, throughout this conversation so far, you make notions of, what it takes to have a good blockbuster hit, right? Mm-hmm. So in that regard, yeah, maybe it was better to have a more traditional good versus evil, a more one-sided story. Well, as someone who, played Warcraft, played particularly World of Warcraft, I mean, I can't see myself playing Alliance when I play World of Warcraft. You just can't do it. You got to go Horde. The characters are just cooler. They're more flavorful. And I think a lot of people are in my boat where they've played, some sure played Alliance, but some people played Horde. They've been playing that game for like a decade, right? They don't see their side as like the bad guys. Obviously, there's good and bad on both sides. So I think Blizzard just wanted to deliver for what their players expected from Warcraft. And that's what they went with. Whether that would have sold more or less tickets, I don't know. But that's certainly a part of the movie that I liked. I think it was a pretty fair portrayal of both races, I guess, both sides in a way, where both sides have the very evil and the very good, and you can kind of have to wonder when a character is introduced which side they're on.
Well, what if the movie had been just focused on the Horde, and as you know, the orcs are the good guys and the humans are the bad guys?
Well, I would have liked that more, but I have to respect the fact that probably people who've been playing Alliance for 10 years may not see it that way.
What do you think about this, Noble?
I 100% agree. This is a Warcraft movie, so it is Alliance and Horde. You want to satisfy both sides. It falls back to the whole trilogy kind of deal. Like, if you got more time for it, perhaps you got more story to tell. But at the end of the day, I don't think the problem with the movie that I have is because it's tried to sympathize on both sides. I just think that it has a lackluster of character development. So to say both sides, to please both sides, I think 100%. And if they didn't, if they purely went with the human side of things, then we would only have like the bland characters that we have on the human side. Whereas the orcs are really a lot more interesting, in my opinion, and a lot more relatable and a lot more developed than the human side. So in that case, then we just ended up with the humans, which wouldn't have been a great situation either. I will say, though, on the Horde side as well, I've heard criticism about Duratan and Orgrim, and Orgrim's betrayal being very, very rushed. Again, that word rushed, that's just, in my opinion, a major problem with the movie. Not so much the story that they tried to tell.
So you both think it was the right call to try to represent both sides equally?
The right call for people who play Warcraft games. But whether that's the right call in general, I mean, I don't know.
I'm talking about in terms of the right call for the movie itself, because you got 2 hours, 120 minutes to work with.
That's such a challenge, right? To predict that. Like if you make it about one side and the other, you alienate so much of the core fan base to maybe please people who've probably never invested themselves in Warcraft, right?
Well, and it's called Warcraft after all. Like, you want to bring in those fans of your game and not just one side of the faction. It goes back to the idea of alienating half of your audience.
Well, would it have really alienated people? We already talked about all the changes that they made to the lore. So if that didn't alienate, hardcore Warcraft fans, would giving one side, well, okay. But I think the super, at least from Krip's perspective, the movie seemed to cater to the super fans pretty well. So if they're already changing all these lore things which alienates, the super fans, to try to bring in more general audiences by just focusing on one of the factions, wouldn't that have been like a better call, do you think?
Well, the question is, would the general audience even come to begin with? Even if you make it more streamlined and more general and hit all the plot points that every other movie hits, would that bring butts into the seats? Or do you want to make this for the purpose that you had in mind, which is make a Warcraft movie and bring it to life? Because you're gambling either way. You're gambling that you can bring in a general audience to something labeled Warcraft, which already has a reputation of being a video game and not everybody's down with that. Or do you rather focus on the audience that you're going to have and try to please both sides in that regard? And when it comes to alienating with the lore change, I know quite a few people that said like they have just changed the lore too much. I'll see it as its own thing, but this is just not for me anymore. So there's definitely been a couple out there that were like, yeah, there's just too many changes in that.
Well, I think that there's an argument to be made where, as a filmmaker, as someone who's writing and directing a movie, you have to keep your audience in mind. And Duncan Jones said that they were making this for the Warcraft fans, and yet he changed a bunch of stuff that, as Noble just said, like it pissed off a lot of hardcore fans. So if you're already going to piss those people off, why not tailor your movie to appeal to the broadest possible audience, and just try to focus on telling a good story as opposed to just throwing all the bones to the people who are familiar with the stuff. Like, Krip, am I off here in your opinion?
I don't know. There's a lot of sides to this, so I feel like people just pick one just on how they see things. But in terms of like the overall success, it's just a bit too hard to tell in a lot of these situations.
I guess, in my opinion, if I was working with Blizzard, I'd want the first movie to be a huge hit, as big of a hit as possible, so that I could ensure I could make more movies down the line. And I think that, you know, what happened with the first Warcraft movie was they tried to please too many masters, and everyone just kind of ended up being like, you know, with the end product. And we saw that in the box office success of, you know, the first Warcraft movie, where it didn't even hit like $50 million on a $160 million budget. So I feel like,
well, I think there's maybe another aspect here that doesn't have to do with the movie itself, that just has to do more with real life in terms of the making money at the box office. A lot of people who play World of Warcraft for 10 years have heard about websites where you can steal movies. And a lot of those people don't have as much expendable dollars to go to the movies as well. So like the target audience that they want to hit isn't exactly rolling it and ignorant as to other means to see movies.
I don't know about that though, because there is a big, you know, movie-going audience for science fiction and fantasy fare. The Lord of the Rings movies were huge box office hits. Even the Hobbit movies, which weren't as good,
yeah, but the Lord of the Rings fans before the movies came out weren't playing Lord of the Rings games for 10 years, 20 years straight on their computer, right? So I think it's certainly a factor in this case. It's also like, think of it this way. So if you're a person who's a big Lord of the Rings fan and the movie comes out, you're like, yeah, I don't want to just go by myself. I'm going to bring my friends. I'm going to bring my family. But if the Warcraft movie comes out and you don't have $20 to spend and you know how to watch it otherwise, you watch it yourself at home, right? So I don't think that's a small factor at all.
Well, but Warcraft fans, they're, I think at its height, Warcraft hit something like 24 million subscribers, and they were all paying a monthly fee to play the game. So like they can't shell out money for a ticket. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But I think you're right that, you know, there is a certain pirating culture, but I mean, you can say that for every movie. There are people out there who will illegally download it and watch it at home, or, you know, something.
But how can you pay for your ticket when you're already paying for your game? You know, you got to make choices where your money is going.
I know a lot of people who actually stopped playing World of Warcraft because they couldn't see themselves paying the subscription every month. So it's not a fair statement to say that these guys pay this money that they can just afford other expendables.
And when it comes to your argument, by the way, about making a good movie and telling both sides of the story, is it truly impossible to do both? Like we've seen an example here, in my opinion, where it didn't come to the front, but I don't think necessarily it is impossible to tell a good story with both the Alliance and Horde represented.
It's not impossible, but when you're dealing with 120-minute runtime, it's very challenging. And I don't feel like Duncan Jones was a experienced enough filmmaker and storyteller to pull that off. Now, Sam Raimi might have been able to do it because you know, he's a very talented filmmaker, and he's someone who's been telling stories for decades, and you know, he doesn't shy away from those complicated narrative choices. So I think it just came down to the skill of the guy in charge, and I don't think Duncan Jones was a guy, like, visually the movie looks great. I think visually, like, Duncan Jones did a great job with the film, but in terms of handling the actual story, the writing of it, he might have just been a little bit too inexperienced to try and do everything. And there's also the factor that he might have had a lot of other cooks in the kitchen. Like Blizzard might have been insisting that certain things be included. The studio might have been insisting certain things. You just don't know. But I don't think it's impossible if you're dealing with a 3-hour movie. Like that definitely would have helped it out. But a 2-hour movie is very hard to tell such, especially considering both sides of the story were very epic to begin with. So I think, you know, that's an issue too. But the thing I'm getting from both of you is that it's really important to have understood the audience, not just the general audience that they're telling the movie, you know, the Warcraft story for, like the general fantasy audience, but the actual Warcraft fans as well.
One question I have, because we're constantly talking about the fact that, you know, the amount of money that they made in the US is not adequate. I guess, you know, we're just kind of we accept that, right? But I am a little bit ignorant on the subject. How typical is it that a movie that makes $40-some million in the US makes 400 million internationally? Because it does seem like a lot. So did it really fail, or did it just fail at home?
It failed at home. The thing that really saved Warcraft internationally was China. The Chinese box office accounted for the bulk of that 400 and something million dollars that it ended up taking in. And without China, it would have definitely been considered a failure. The fact that it didn't hit like at least a $50 million box office domestically was a big deal, because the way it works is you got to take a movie's budget and double that, because of the money that they spend on marketing and advertising. So we're looking at a 300 something million dollar movie here. So you got to at least make that much money back in order to just break even, and then everything on top of that. So Warcraft probably netted a little bit under 100 million in terms of actual profit, and that was just all because of China. And the fact that it failed domestically just tells the Hollywood studios, hey, there's not an audience for this stuff here in America, and this is usually where we make the bulk of our money. So it's a bigger risk to shell out money for a sequel if the American audiences are going to sit this one out, because when it comes to the Chinese box office, there's a lot of things that get kind of wonky with it, because the government has so much control over what movies are allowed to be shown there, and how much you can charge for a ticket, and how much gets back to the studio and stuff like that. So it can be a little bit of a messy proposition to bank entirely on the Chinese box office for a movie.
Did you just say 100 million profit?
Roughly something like that.
Wow.
Like if you double the film's budget, so the film's budget was 160 million, and just like a rule of thumb for Hollywood movies is like you spend as much on the marketing of a movie as you spend on the making of a movie. So if you're making a $160 million movie, the total cost of that movie in terms of the making and the marketing of it is going to be like $320 million. So if you doubled the budget, so if you made $444 million worldwide, you subtract 360 from that, or 320 from that, that's the amount of profit that you made. That doesn't include things like home video sales and streaming stuff.
It also doesn't include the advertising you're doing for the game that's still going on, right?
Well, the game's different because that falls under Blizzard's budget.
I mean from Blizzard's perspective, like.
But the movie itself was a huge advertisement for the game.
That's what I mean, right? So it's not like they have to sell action figures. Like if people get interested in World of Warcraft, they can just buy themselves a subscription right away, right? Like those avenues are there.
The difference is that I don't believe Blizzard put up any money for the movie. That was strictly it was either Lionsgate or I forget the studio that actually produced the film. But this if the studio didn't make money, they're like, well, we're not going to put up more money for another one. So Blizzard they won either way, but I feel like the studio behind it was just glad that they weren't facing a huge loss on the film. But I want to keep the focus on the writing as opposed to the Hollywood inside baseball stuff. So why don't we talk about one of what I feel is the most forced subplot in the film, which is the romance between the half orc, half human character of Garona and Anduin-Lothar. Not only did the romance between those two feel rushed, at least in my opinion, but it didn't really come off as believable. Like there wasn't really any chemistry there. So what I want to know, and I believe in the source material, Lothar and Garona never had any type of like romantic relationship. So why do you think it was included, and how do you think it could have been better handled? And in addition to that, should it have been removed from the story entirely, or how could it have been done better? And Kripp, I know you said that you kind of like it when they leave the romance out of these things. So why don't we start with you?
Well, one of the things that they try to just squeeze into every movie is some kind of new romance. Like it's not enough to highlight like the romance between, I don't know, the king and queen or something like that. That doesn't cut it. It's got to be like keeping you wondering. It's like, it seems like there's something going on between these two characters. Some people actually, this is why they watch a movie for some reason. So when they see the romance develop as the movie goes on, they get that form of satisfaction. That's why they're watching. So I guess whoever made the call did it because that's just an element of a typical movie. And they got to tie in the orcs with the humans. I mean, we made the argument that maybe they didn't need to, maybe they didn't even need the translation, and I would argue in your favor, but I think this is why it ended up that way. They just, they didn't quite take out all of the typical movie ingredients when it came to constructing the Warcraft movie.
What do you think about that, Noble? Do you think that the romance between Garona and Lothar was needed, or do you think it could have been improved in some way?
I mean, was it needed? No. I mean, the original story didn't need it either. Fun fact, the original story, Lothar was like an old dude. He was not this handsome, heroic knight that was going on. He was just a regular old knight. Very powerful, but not as handsome and young as he was in the movie. I really feel that it has to do with the build-up that they wanted for the second movie. And that has to do with Garona seemingly betraying them, Lothar having a stronger connection to her because of this love relation. And therefore, in the next movie or the next storyline that they possibly wanted to tell, that would hit so much harder. Next to that, there's also, of course, a powerful female character that actually takes a big chunk of the story, where the rest of it is a bit of a sausage fest, as it already was in the original story. This time around, we also have Queen Tiffin and Garona taking front and center, which I personally really liked. Was it needed for the story? Again, I would argue that I kind of like the aspect where Garona is this bridge between the worlds, because that is, at the end of the day, the story they wanted to tell. They wanted Durotan to come closer to the humans and be like, yeah, we want to make peace. We want to unite against the rest of our people because we know what's going down is not the right thing. If we do want to cut out Garona, then we had to sit down and make a whole rewrite of the storyline and just cut out the storyline of Durotan and the humans meeting up entirely.
When it comes to romances in movies or just stories in general, I think they're included because it's something that everyone, man, woman, old, young, whatever, it's something that people can relate to, and it's something that is able to hook people into a story. And if you fall in love with these characters, you want to see them, kind of end up together. And so, as a storytelling device, love stories are really powerful things that can kind of get an audience to invest in a movie. And you have lots of examples out there of movies that are pretty terrible movies, but you're so invested in the romance aspect of those movies that you don't care about the rest of it. Something like the Twilight Saga, for instance. I'm not a big fan of those movies personally, but the people who are fans of them, they're so invested in the romance angle there that whatever else is going on in the movie, they don't really care about. It's all about Edward and Bella. So I don't fault movies for trying to put these things in, but I do fault them when they're done badly. I feel like the Garona thing was done badly because, first of all, you have this obstacle you have to overcome in the sense that she's basically an alien. Like she's green skin, she's got the teeth, and they really kind of toned down the teeth with her. But she was played by a actual actress as opposed to being full CG, like the rest of the orcs were. And so you have that initial obstacle of like she's very different from your typical romantic lead, I'd say. But more than that, throughout the course of her interactions with Lothar, Anduin, there was never any real connection there. There was never anything that drew me in as an audience member and be like, yeah, I want to see these two together. Or, yeah, they have really good chemistry. You have this whole star-crossed lovers trope, stuff like West Side Story, where you have, a real attraction between a female and a male, but there's other things keeping them from being together, even though they really want to make that happen. And I feel like this could have been a great, setup for that type of thing, where you have the orcs versus humans, and that's the star-crossed lovers trope right there. But it just felt like, like almost it was a lazy attempt to make this romance work. Would you guys agree with that?
I don't know if it was lazy, but it didn't seem very effective.
Yeah, it just failed. But that's pretty much in the human camp when it comes to story development. It's just underdeveloped, and there's no real connection between these characters. And when it comes to Garona-Lothar, that's the same. But the same could be said about the King and Khadgar and Medivh. All of them just walk there, and you're like, yeah, I know that you are given a name. I know that you're supposed to be this character. But who are you? What's your background? What's your motivation? What exactly have you done? You get this random-ass camp scene where they're just sitting around, and all of a sudden Garona tells Khadgar, like, you want to do me? Out of the blue. And it's like, oh, cool. This is the part where we just tell our backstories now. And it's so unearned, and it's so underdeveloped. Whereas if you compare it to the Orc side, where you have a Durtan and a Draka, and they lie in their tent, and Draka is pregnant, and they laugh, and they goof, and they show you that there's a character behind just what they're trying to show you, you immediately hook on and feel a lot better about it. And I feel that's when it comes to Garona-Lothar. They got like a drunk scene where he's grieving over what happened with his son, and that's about it. Same with his son, where the moment where his son says like dad instead of commander, and I'm like, yeah, I know that you're trying to establish a family relation, but maybe show them together throwing a ball around or something like that, instead of, yeah, you're my dad, aren't you? Oh, look, he's dead. Oh, I must feel sad for Lothar now. That does not work. You need to build those things up. But again, you don't have the time for that. So, hi, dad. Bye, dad. I'm sad now.
Yeah, that's a big issue. And I think a primary example of what you were talking about was when Lothar was inexplicably jailed for telling the king that his plan was a bad one, which it was. And Garona goes to visit him, and they have this kind of moment between them, between the bars. And it felt like the most romantic moment of their subplot in the entire movie. But at the same time, it also felt like way too rushed and way too forced. And it just didn't come off as being authentic. And I think for a good romance to happen, it needs to be authentic. It needs to be believable that these two characters would want to be together and that there's an attraction there. And I just didn't get that from Garona. And another issue with Garona is that, well, there are multiple issues with Garona, but the big one is that all the human characters in the movie really seem to quickly form incredibly strong bonds with her. Like both Anduin and Khadgar seem to accept her as part of their little band of soldiers very quickly. Lady Taria seems to accept her instantly. Like there's no distrust there on her part. Even King Lane trusts her to kill him in order to attempt to make peace between the Orcs and the humans. And Medivh even goes so far as to embrace her, implying that she's actually his daughter, which was kind of weird, because if we go back to Nobbel's talk about Garona thinking Khadgar wants to lie with her, she makes it a big point. Talk about how dangerous that is for frail humans, because Orcs like to break bones when they're having sex or something. So I can't imagine someone like Ben Foster faring well with a full-grown female orc. But despite this emphasis on the character of Garona, none of the loyalty or affection from the humans really seems like it's been earned by her. So what do you think of the character of Garona in the movie, and why do you think so much importance was placed on her, and how could she have been better developed? Nobbel, why don't we start with you?
When it comes to not earned, by the way, I'm trying to remember. Doesn't she have like a couple of scenes where she fights with the humans and they're like in combat together and whatnot? Isn't that where she's supposed to earn this trust? Like, I understand it's underdeveloped, of course, but wasn't that where that's supposed to happen? Or I'm misremembering now.
I feel like the first time that she actually fights with the humans is at the Blackrock meeting, where they're ultimately betrayed by the Orcs. But everything happens before that, where the queen basically thinks that she's okay. They have that scene where it's like, oh, if you want to lie with me, all that stuff happens before she actually does any fighting. Like up till that point, she's just their captive, basically.
And sorry, the question was with Garona's development, what could have done better about her? What was the question?
The question I have is, why do you think the movie put so much importance on her, and how do you think they could have developed her better to warrant that type of importance?
Why they did, I honestly don't know. Again, perhaps the bridge between worlds, as well as a strong female character. And what could I have done possibly to develop that more? It falls back to the same reasoning. I'm just repeating myself, which is development time, not rushing it, giving it moments to grow one another instead of a random scene where she sits around the camp and they do their kumbayayas. Have people out, have people talk with one another, show how she learned this language. Because a big portion of the movie, to me, when I watched it, felt like it's a very short time span, right? You go from Garona going through the portal to all of a sudden she speaks common, she speaks the human language. And it's like, when did that happen? Well, apparently they've been capturing these humans for a very long time and she's been talking to them. Okay, cool. But to me, it feels like we went through the portal and now we're capturing humans. And again, development time, show them together. In the original story, it was more of, she was sent there to Khadgar's tower, of Medivh's tower even, wasn't Khadgar's tower quite yet. And together with Khadgar, she uncovers that there's like a demon in the tower and there's something going on with Sargeras. And she slowly but surely earns his trust. Because at the beginning, he did not trust it at all. And in the Warcraft movie, he captures her. And then indeed, they go on their jolly adventures. So again, time and development, that's what stuff like this needs.
What do you think, Krip?
Just kind of to add on that, I mean, you obviously can't disagree with those statements. But to add on that, I think the reason why her trust is not really contested is because the orcs are seen, at least the way the movie portrays them, as like really dumb brutes. So their actions are kind of interpreted plainly. So if she's like a prisoner, they don't assume that she's going to double cross them, right? I think that's just kind of how the movie introduces these characters. They don't really show the complexity in any of the orcs besides Gul'dan. And that comes very much later. And a lot of that comes through Garona herself. So I think that's why there's a lot of that established automatic trust. I think it's a pretty weak line of development in the movie from that, but I think that's why you see it the way it ended up.
You know, when you have a character earn loyalty and affection from other characters, there has to be kind of a instigating factor behind that. Just if you're writing something appropriately, it's very rare for characters who aren't Mary Sues or Gary Stews to instantly be liked and trusted by other characters unless they've done something to warrant it. And with Garona, you know, at least in the source material, she was kind of sent to infiltrate the human faction by Gul'dan, who was secretly controlling her mind. Am I correct on that, Noble?
Yeah, she was sent to infiltrate. Like, we know, of course, there's the whole allegiance between Medivh and Gul'dan, but Gul'dan didn't actually know that it was Medivh. And she is indeed sent over to learn information. And over time, she actually finds out that she likes the humans more than her own orcs.
Yeah, so I feel like if she had gone to, like, if she had found the human camp and gone to them and be like, hey, I'm half orc, I'm half human, the orcs treat me terribly, I want to side with you guys. And then she did stuff to prove that she was on the human side by warning them about an impending attack or saving some of them from orcs when they're attacking or something like that. Then her trust could have been warranted by the other characters. But instead, like, she's captured, and the minute she's captured, just because she happens to speak the human's language, they just instantly seem like, oh, she's cool, we're going to let her walk right up to our king, no worries. So I feel like when you have characters in positions like this, you always need to give them reasons why other people should actually trust them and invest in them and consider them to be allies. Because Garona, just for being who she is, just seemed to instantly warrant everyone treating her like she's special. And I think that's a narrative flaw that really plagued this movie, because every time Garona was on screen, I kind of checked out almost, because I wasn't buying any of it. Do you guys feel the same way?
Well, you mentioned that she was special, but for the humans, like part of the reason why they're so kind to her is also to show that the humans have kindness within them, right?
Yeah.
Like they show her basic human traits, like have some blankets. He's not my mate, he's my brother. The king is my mate. Kind of like trying to bring these two different worlds together. Garona is a character that knows nothing but cruelty and misery and torture from the hands of her own people, and here she enters this world where people are actually kind to one another from her point of view that motivates her to be kind to the humans in turn. And when it comes to them treating her as if she's special and then taking her along on the adventures, she is extremely special. There's this alien invading force, these green brutes that just scream Lothar as they battle. And here she is. She can talk, she can reason, she shows the first sign of intelligence, their first angle into figuring out more about the Orcish world. So to say that she gets treated special, I would say that has a lot of reason. And then over time, if I remember right, with like the Blackrock Mountain meeting where she gets finally thrown a weapon because you can help fight and whatnot. I feel that they tried to develop that. You could find the hints of it there, but again, it should have been fleshed out.
What do you think, Krip?
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. There's a lot of complexity to her. A lot of things have some reasoning, but at the same time, we just talked about how they could have left out her role entirely. So it's a matter of taste and decisions. Was she really valuable to the story? Yes, in some ways. Could it have been done differently? Yeah. I think her role in the movie was a pretty weak part for me. So I'm more to agree with the fact that they probably should have given her less of a role. But that's as far as I can get on that.
Yeah, and I do agree with Noble that the movie did go a long way to show that she was kind of special and integral to the human-orc relations. What I mean by special is that even though humans are kind, Garona never did anything to warrant trust as opposed to kindness, and I feel like she was just trusted way too quickly. But moving on, a huge part of making pretty much any fantasy film work is the world building. And if there's one thing Warcraft has an abundance of, it's world building. So sometimes I would even say that there's almost too much world building in the sense of the Warcraft universe never really being fully explained or established when elements of it are introduced in the movie. So how well do you think this aspect of the fantasy genre was handled in Warcraft in terms of the world building? And what did the movie do right in building out the world of Azeroth and for its audience? And what did it do wrong? What do you think, Krip?
I think the scenery, let's say, I like to call it, the background, the scenery. I think it was generally very good. It felt like a world that you can believe. It felt good as someone who's explored World of Warcraft, as a gamer, as hopefully their target market for this film. I was impressed in a lot of the details that I saw. In terms of too much, world building, as you call it, yeah, a lot of it wasn't explained, but this has been a common thing we talk about where maybe it was a good idea to emphasize more detail on certain aspects of what you see. So yeah, again, it goes back to where do they draw the line? What do they want to focus on? What kind of balance do they want to all the different elements of the film within the given time frame they have? In terms of one thing I remember not liking that much was the big fight that was kind of in like the arid cliffs / desert, like during the ambush where Medivh comes in with the force fields and stuff. For some reason, I just didn't like that. And that was like a battle scene. So it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly what I would have done better. But I feel like in a lot of those moments, like the orc warriors were just coming out of actually nowhere. I didn't really understand the nature of the spell that was being cast. I don't know. I felt like maybe they could have simplified down a little bit more, and made it more of like a hand-to-hand type of combat situation as they did in the earlier scenes. But other than that, I don't remember being too disappointed with the other elements of the world.
What did you think of the world building, Noble?
And when we're talking about world building, we're talking about how they made it all look, right?
Well, we're talking about different aspects of this universe that they've created. So it's not just the vistas, it's not just the background, but it's things like the history and the locations and the different factions and the different races and things of that nature.
Right. Well, in that regard, I think that's one of the strongest points that the Warcraft movie has to offer. I wouldn't have mind if they stuck around in Draenor a little bit longer, maybe show it before it was destroyed and then into what it has become, so that we can see the motivation more clearly. We know that Dirt and an Orgrim are talking about it, like how was life on their planets. I wouldn't have mind to see like the glory days of the Orcs and see the different clans. Then there was the whole Dalaran floating. A lot of people were confused about Dalaran floating. Like, didn't it go up into the sky later in the storyline and what's going on? Which gave a great reason to explain, like, the Warcraft movie, its own universe, don't worry about it. It's not what happened in the real story. But besides that, I felt like world building visually was the strongest suits. And when it comes to backgrounds, when it comes to storylines, this needed a lot more. If we're talking about like the backgrounds of certain characters and whatnot, I would be surprised if people took out that Medivh was actually Garona's father, because I didn't pick it up the first time and I only found out about it later. And who is this Khadgar character, and who is this Muruz, and who is this Lane? And I know that they got like books and comics to explain it further, and I've read those. But I don't feel like you can expect your movie-going audience to first read up on your literature before they go sit down and watch your movie. That should just be in there and explained. And even for someone like myself that read it, still sat down and I look at these characters, especially on the human side, and I'm like, yeah, you could be anyone, really. I don't know who you are. From this movie, I do not know who you are. And in that regard, it should have been doing a lot more, in my opinion.
From my perspective, there were a lot of elements that were very quickly introduced in the film that I felt like needed to be expanded upon just for the audience's sake, for people who aren't familiar with this world. Like, for instance, the biggest thing for me was the Kirin Tor. I was never really clear on who they were and what role they had to play. I was never really clear on the rules of the magic system being used. And how I know people who probably play the game are 100% clear on this stuff, but I haven't played World of Warcraft since 2005 or something. And
to be fair, this is the first time that they used their Kirin Tor tattoo as like a barometer meter to find like a book. I've never seen that used in game before, so that was new. That was kind of cool.
And even stuff like like who is the Guardian? What are his duties? I know that in the Warcraft lore, Anduin Lothar, King Lane, and Medivh were childhood friends, and they kind of hinted at that in the film, but we never really got a sense of like history between these three guys. We never got the sense that they were like really good friends with one another. Just the chemistry between all three of them just seemed kind of weird. So it's little things like that I feel like, okay, you're just to assume certain things about this stuff when the proper way to do it would be to actually maybe like tell you just a little bit. You don't need much more than like a line or two of dialogue or something like that to explain what the Kirin Tor are or what have you. Other things like Khadgar's relationship to Medivh, like we got the sense that he was kind of set to take Medivh's role as Guardian. But I think in the Warcraft lore, he was Medivh's apprentice. So their relationship was never really kind of clear to me. And there's just like a lot of stuff. Like, it's cool to see like a Murloc, and it's cool to see like the Flying Griffin and things like that. But at the same time, it's like, well, can we get more about the Draenei? Like, who are they? What are they in relation to the Orcs and things like that? So I just feel like there was so much dumped on us in this movie. And if you didn't know going in a lot of these elements, they were just kind of like almost overwhelming because you didn't understand them. Am I off base with that, Krip?
No, I get that. It's the common theme where most things required more focus, more attention, versus how much time can they really put into 2 hours worth of content. It's really hard to argue a lot of the points that all of us are bringing to the table. where maybe the question should be asked is like, what is the exact focus that we expected to see, right?
That's a good point. Noble, what do you think about that?
Like for me, the exact focus, like I said, my only expectation was to see the Warcraft movie, the Warcraft world come to life, and they delivered on that. And when it comes to the storyline, it's difficult. Like I'm not a movie writer. I'm just sitting here and I know the story behind it, but try to put it down in a script. Like I have problems cutting down my own videos. But to your point of the Draenei, 100% agree. Like you see these Draenei in the cages, right? And they're being absorbed. So your basic knowledge is like, okay, cool. So these people are absorbed and then they're powering the portal. But who are they? How did they end up in these cages? What exactly happened on this world? Like I mentioned, I would have loved to stay on Draenor a little bit longer. The Cadent Tor, not explained. True. But I would argue instead of just a couple of lines to explain it, I felt like there were a lot of lines to explain something really quickly. I would have loved to see these things rather than just lines telling me that these things happened.
Yeah, and another thing that I felt was kind of missing for the Warcraft movie was the sense of geography. Like in Lord of the Rings, they really they show you a map where everything is, and so you kind of get a sense of, okay, Mordor's over here and this thing's over there and stuff like that. With Warcraft, we get one scene with the king when he's interrogating Garona, and there's like a map of Azeroth on the ceiling, but we never get a sense of like where's Stormwind in relation to the Black Gate, or what does the geography of this world really look like? And I feel like that was a part of world building that was actually missing from this movie. So moving on, let's talk about Khadgar. And an interesting thing to me was that at least in Sam Raimi's version of the film, Khadgar was going to be the main character, and he was meant to kind of tie the story and the battle of the orcs and humans together. So he was going to be the central focus of the film. But after Duncan Jones took over, the focus was split between Anduin and Durotan, and with Khadgar basically relegated to a bit of a supporting role. Noble, I know that you did a great video kind of explaining the story of Khadgar. How do you think the character of Khadgar was handled in the movie? And do you think it would have been stronger had the movie focused on him as the main character instead of splitting between Anduin and Durotan, or even just focusing on him and Durotan as opposed to having Lothar in there?
I know that Khadgar had a lot of fan favorites from the Warcraft movie, and he had a couple of fun things in there. I really liked that sheep moment. I thought that was funny. I really liked to see him actually level up in the movie. That was kind of cool. But the rest, I mean, if you want to play a fun drinking game, just take a shot every time he says Guardian. You'll be wasted halfway through a movie. Like, Guardian, please pay attention to me, Guardian. It's like, I like the original setup with Khadgar better, where he was actually a badass Kirin Tor mage sent over to the tower. He was good enough to be Medivh's apprentice. And Medivh was like, prove yourself to me, apprentice, because, you're not the first one that they send over. You're like number 100. Why are you so special? I like that setup better than what we got in the Warcraft movie, which is just a puppy following the Guardian around like, oh, I heard stories about you, and I took notes. And then the Guardian is like, why did you take notes? When it comes to focusing on the story from Khadgar's perspective, I think it's an interesting idea. I think it's interesting to see Khadgar as like the outside guy and then two factions trying to come together. Might have worked better. But it's hard to say if you don't see a script and a movie in front of you, but it's definitely a fun concept, yeah.
What do you think, Krip? How do you think Khadgar was treated in the movie, and do you think that he might have been a stronger main character to follow through?
I think Khadgar was treated pretty well in the movie, given that he wasn't the main role. I think the story of Warcraft is best told first and foremost in kind of like a more serious and gritty fashion. So I'm okay with them using Khadgar to tell the story, but Khadgar in the Warcraft movie was very much like the whimsical character. And I don't think the story of Warcraft should be told through that. So I'm okay with them choosing Khadgar, but not that Khadgar. it would have to be, again, the more badass mage. It'd have to be, because the Khadgar that most of the time we experience in previous World of Warcraft media is the badass Khadgar. You know, he's like some crazy cool old mage. He's been through all the shit. He's been through all of it. And he's got the skills, he's got the knowledge, he's clever, and more importantly, he's epic. You know, that's what you want to convey. Now, if you want to tell the story where he's, you know, a whimsical dumb kid, then that's fine. But I don't think he should be the main character if they choose to go down that path. So I think that was pretty fair. Like both the focuses on, you know, the human side and the orc side, they both had their grittiness, they both had their epic moments. So I think given the point in which this story took place, the main character selection was adequate in my mind.
I think my biggest problem with the character of Khadgar in the Warcraft movie was that I did not like the actor who was playing him. You know, nothing against that guy, but I just feel like he was miscast. Like if they wanted to go with the youthful Khadgar, they should have cast someone with a little bit more weight to them. I feel like he just didn't carry the character the way that the character deserved to be carried in the film. And the interesting thing about Khadgar is that, you know, he's the guy who uncovers Medivh's role in you know, bringing the orcs over into Azeroth. And in the source material, the way he does it is way more interesting than how he does it in the movie. And Khadgar's relationships with the other characters is way more interesting in the source material. And it makes me wonder why they didn't do a better translation from what's in the games to what's in the movie. Why do you think they chose to go the way they did, Noble?
Your guess is as good as mine, to be honest. I'm 100% on board. The character Medivh was a lot more interesting in the source material, as well as Khadgar and most of the humans on their side. Why choose to make Khadgar like this funny character? I mean, you need a bit of a relief, like when you have this I can do anything kind of guy like Lothar, who then drinks himself to a stupor. Maybe it's nice to have a bit of a breather and actually have a bit of laughs here and there. But why? I have no idea why they made that choice. I don't really see a massive reason right now for it.
Yeah.
Maybe Krip?
I'm happy with how they did that aspect of the movie, so okay.
Well, I think both Medivh and Khadgar were miscast. You know, they're fine actors on their own, but I like in my head and just from what the games gave us, like that wasn't the Medivh that I had pictured. That wasn't the Khadgar that I had pictured, and I think that kind of took me out of it a little bit.
The way I see it is like, I think the role that Khadgar had, given the lines and his actions, I think he was cast okay. Like, sure, there's probably always someone better out there, but I think he was cast okay. The way that I saw Khadgar in the movie was like he was the young puppy. Like, this guy is like pretty clueless, but you see into his future genius, I guess. But yeah, he's whimsical, he's dumb, he does dumb stuff. So I don't know. Again, I would have preferred them not use that Khadgar to begin with. And of course, if they didn't use that Khadgar, of course it was a miscast. But I think for their intention, which again I don't exactly agree with, I think it was cast all right.
I would agree. I think that the Khadgar that we got, the kid played a good role for that. But Medivh is like a zombie walking around. And Medivh is so interesting, such a conflicting character. And his inner turmoil reflected within the tower itself. And shadows that are not his own. And you slowly but surely figure out what's going on there. And you just see this guy walking around, mesmerizing this spell to himself and building a golem. And it's like, is that the most interesting part of you? Which is a shame, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. So I try not to focus too much on casting choices because that's not really a writing type thing. So I try to keep those out of there. But I just personally, like, those two casting choices to me took me out of the movie. I like Travis Flamel as Lothar and all that stuff, but those two in particular were just didn't feel right for the characters that they were playing, at least in my opinion. So let's talk about one of the biggest issues with the film, which in my opinion is its pacing. Events in this film happen incredibly fast, and the pacing feels very rushed, to the point where none of the storylines or subplots really get enough time to properly develop, in my opinion. And audiences didn't get the time they really needed to connect with any of these characters. However, it's because there are so many subplots and characters that the movie's pace has to be quick in order to fit everything into the 120-minute runtime. So let me ask you guys, what, if any, subplots or characters do you think could have been removed in order to slow the pace down a bit and allow other subplots and characters to be further developed? What do you think about that, Krip?
I mean, we've touched upon this a lot, and it's very difficult to make it work one way or the other. I really think what they should have done to properly communicate all of Warcraft, all of the different details to adequate levels, was probably just to do 2 movies at once. Kind of like how I think The Matrix did it with 2 and 3, where they release like some months apart, and one can have the human focus and one can have the orc focus, and they just allow themselves more time to make it happen. Other than that, it's really tough to have good solutions to such, I don't know, a pod of rich characters, rich themes, rich interactions, rich lore, rich worlds. Everything is too rich. There's almost no pleasing everyone with that time frame. That's just the end of it, I think.
Yeah, Noble, you talked a little bit about this earlier, where they tried to do too much in too little time. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, we touched upon it a couple of times now, indeed. Maybe the Garona plot line that they could cut out of there. But I honestly, for the movie that we had, to with all the storylines that are going on, with the runtime that they have, I don't really see what they can cut out of there to still make it sense. To still have the movie make sense and just end up where we actually end up in the movie. That indeed falls into the line of maybe cut it up in 3 parts, Horde, Alliance, and then the ending of it all. Maybe. But for the movie that we have, I honestly don't know what they could have cut out of. I just wish that they sat down and just rewrote the whole thing and actually got a proper story with development in there. But that's talking about a whole different movie than what we got.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to storytelling, pacing is one of the most important things. Like, you don't want a story to feel long, and you don't want a story to feel too quick. You want to try to hit that sweet spot where things are moving along at a good pace, but it's not so fast that stuff doesn't get developed properly. And I feel like with Warcraft, little things like just like reminding the audience of how much time has passed. Like we've talked about this before, where, you know, we don't know how Garona learned the common tongue, but it's implied that, you know, there were human prisoners that she was around and she just kind of picked it up by being around them. But how long was it between when the orcs first came into Azeroth and, you know, you have that first confrontation with Lothar's hunting band and the orcs and stuff like that. So a lot of this breakneck pace kind of glosses over the passage of time, and we don't know how long it really takes to travel in this world. Like, we go from Stormwind to that village right after Khadgar kind of discovers that Fel is involved in this stuff and he needs to talk to the king. It's literally like 3 scenes of like 2 seconds each. You know, we see Stormwind, we cross over that bridge with the Murloc at it, and then we're at the village. And it happens over the course of maybe like 5-6 seconds. And we're like, how long did that take? Like, we don't know where anything is in this world. And I feel like another big thing of this is that if the movie had just been given a little bit more time, like we already talked about how 40 minutes were cut out of it, if you up that 2-hour runtime to 2.5 hours, that might have fixed a lot of the pacing issues with this movie. But I really think Warcraft probably would have benefited more from a like streaming service original series type thing, where you get like 10 to 13 episodes to tell a story, as opposed to, you know, a 2-hour movie. Like, would you guys have rather seen like a Warcraft TV series as opposed to a Warcraft movie?
No,
100%. 100%.
No. TV series
Every
quality
time.
sucks. We're not getting Game of Thrones every TV series. All right, we're getting some like backwater garbage most of the time. I didn't want them to butcher it.
Every time that they release a new cinematic or a Lords of War episode or whatever they got going, the Burdens of Shao, I'm just sitting there and please, Blizzard, give me my Saturday morning cartoon. Give me just my Netflix adaptation. I don't care who I need to pay for it. 100% that I would love to see a series telling the story of Arthas and the rise and the fall and all that. Or indeed the Warcraft movie as we saw it now, but cut up in more pieces. 100%. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about this is that, you have Amazon spending over $1 billion on a Lord of the Rings TV series. You have HBO, which was spending $15 million an episode on Game of Thrones. I do think that Warcraft might have had the potential to be like a new Game of Thrones style show. The only issue would be, the sheer amount of CGI required for, the orcs and stuff. Like you'd really have to either go all in on the CGI aspect of it, or you'd have to, find a way to do it with prosthetics and makeup on actual human actors and stuff. But, we're getting so much great fantasy fare from streamers nowadays. We're getting The Witcher, we're getting Wheel of Time, we're getting, new Lord of the Rings and lots of different Game of Thrones stuff. So I don't think a Warcraft series is too out of the realm of possibility. But I do think that it would definitely, because the Warcraft lore is so expansive, that, a multi-season TV series would be enough time to really kind of flesh it out. But it might even work better as like a Pixar type animated endeavor where everything is kind of like the level of cinematic that we see. Well, in terms of like animated, quality, not an actual Pixar thing, but basically, we get a 45-minute to an hour-long cinematic, telling the story of Warcraft, throughout the series. Like, do you think that would be within your wheelhouse, Krip? I know you're against the TV series thing, but would an animated, highly like well animated version of Warcraft be preferable to like a 2-hour movie?
They've done pretty well with those, so sure. I just feel in terms of the visuals, how the characters were portrayed, it was pretty stunning in a lot of cases. Like, I think a lot of people who are like me, who've watched a lot of these movies, we saw the Warcraft movie, and you're like, wow, that is a sick-looking orc, right? The way it moves, the way it's like clumsy. I don't know. They did so many things right, and I think a lot of that requires a lot of money to be thrown at the screen. And if they're doing it in a cartoon, you can have a good cartoon, but it's not going to have that same gravity. And if you have like a TV series and stuff, I'm sure they'll do an okay job, but I don't think it'll be throwing that much money at it. So I don't know. I like Blizzard when they throw way too much money in a segment, like when they do like a World of Warcraft expansion release. It's like $5 million in 60 seconds. That's what I want to see, right? So I think in that regard, they certainly delivered. And I think doing a movie where potentially the return is theirs is the right medium.
Well, Go ahead, Noble.
Just looking at the YouTube channel, how well received these in-game cinematics and these side projects are, the audio dramas and whatnot. I definitely think that there's an audience for it. Indeed, at the end of the day, you are looking at how much it's going to cost, how long is it going to take. Apparently, rendering these cinematics for 2 minutes already takes a very, very long time. But disregarding the background of it and just wanting it, yes, want it, please, tomorrow.
Yeah, so there is some cachet to a live action adaptation versus a fully blown animated thing, but that line is kind of blurring as technology progresses. But in kind of conjunction with this idea of the animated stuff, lots of the reviews for the Warcraft movie tended to cite the orc storyline as being better written than the human storyline. And you guys have even talked about it earlier in the podcast, where you like the orc story better than the human story. And the reasons that they cite for this is that the characters are better developed and believable on the orc side, despite them being completely animated. There's no actual human performance there. It's motion capture and animated performances. So what I want to know from you guys is, why do you think the orc storyline resonated better with audiences than the human storyline? Krip?
Because orcs are cooler. That seems dumb, but honestly, that is a big part of it. We see these like fantasy movies, and the humans are always boring, and they didn't really do anything to elevate the humans. The humans were kind of just like basic, and the basic humans are not that interesting. I mean, I remember playing through the games, even Warcraft 1, right? That is as basic as it gets. The orcs, they just club stuff down and they throw javelins. But then you got like necromancers and stuff, right? But then if you look at the humans, yeah, the footmen are boring, the archers are boring. But then, they have like priests and stuff that actually heal things. They have like wizards. And you're meant to believe that these are common. But when you see the human side of the movie, it's all like that. I was under the impression that if we would see like, Stormwind and all the residents and stuff, you would have a lot of mages. Maybe they wouldn't do like the craziest thing ever. I was under the impression that you'd have a lot of paladins, right? So like, let's say King Lane goes out to the battlefield, have a bunch of people throw him some blessings and throw him some buffs or something, I feel like the human is just done too ordinary. And there's always humans in these sci-fi things, and they didn't really do much to elevate it from the baseline.
What do you think about that, Noble?
Well, to touch upon like the paladin point, to lore out here, the paladins didn't come until Stormwind fell. So in the movie time period, there were no paladins. Now, of course, they could have changed that, but
change it. Let's go.
Just change it. But when it comes to why does the orcs feel better developed, I think the simple answer is they actually get development. Where with that I mean you see the emotions between Durthandraka and Orgrim, like the three main heroic characters. You see them interact with people like Blackhand and Gul'dan. You can see the conflict with Blackhand. You can see Gul'dan be the bad guy in the fell. And then you take it over to the human side, and they just drop these humans, and they're like, this is Khadgar, this is Medivh, this is Lothar. They're going to have an adventure now. And it's like, who are these people? What have they done? And we talked about it before, where you suddenly hear that he has a child, and you suddenly hear that he comes from the Khadgar. But there is no time taken there to develop them. They're just there. They just show up, and they do their thing, and you're supposed to know who they are, what they feel like, what they taste like, and just enjoy. So the simple answer for me is, yeah, the orcs feel better developed, even though they're CGI, because they actually get development.
Yeah, I was actually surprised that in the movie, the human side, you'd think that they'd include like a dwarf or some type of elf, because there are all these other races, on the human alliance side that even though we were kind of shown them throughout the movie, they were never actual characters in the films. It was all just straight up humans on the Lordaeron side. And I feel like one of the reasons that the orcs were so much better received than the humans were is that, number one, the actors that they got to play the human characters were not all that great. I didn't feel like it was a very well cast film on the human side, whereas the performances from the orcs, the animated performances were actually like really well done. Like the CGI in this movie was amazing. And the character performances of the CGI characters were really good. Like when Durotan shows emotion on his face, like that is so much further and away better than what we get from Travis Flamel, who just kind of has like a regular, expression throughout 90% of the movie. And, there is some development on the human side. Like there was this weird thing where, so we have the whole story between Lothar and his son dying at the hand of Blackhand. And I felt like that was a good setup for their final confrontation, but I was never really too invested in, the relationship there between Lothar and his son. And they also did this weird thing where Khadgar was kind of like a surrogate son figure to Lothar, where at the end, where Lothar kind of recognizes what Khadgar did to help defeat Medivh. He says, like, I'm proud of you. And that just kind of came out of nowhere, because at no point did it ever feel like, Lothar was a real father figure to Khadgar, And so it was a very strange mix of things on the human side that the orc side just kept simple. It was like, this is a guy who wants to protect his clan. He wants to protect his family. He thinks that they're, being led astray by this, bad leader of theirs. and he gets betrayed by, you know, his best friend and all this stuff. And it was just like, it was a very simple, straightforward story, but it was very relatable in a lot of ways. Whereas I feel like the human side was a little bit too convoluted and not as well done. Would you agree with me on that, guys? Krip?
Yeah. I mean, you touched upon, you know, a lot of points that both of us brought up. Orcs are just better.
What do you think about that, Noble?
Yeah, I would. Well, convoluted, not even so much so. Like even the Alliance, the human story is pretty simple. Like we're the humans, we chill out here, but it's just not told. And to your point, by the way, about the elves and the dwarves not showing up again in that time period, the whole Alliance thing wasn't so much set in stone. I was actually surprised that they had the whole round table scene with like we were negotiating, trading one another. That felt like it was a lot more developed than in the original story, where it was just purely orcs versus humans.
Yeah, and kind of going along with that thread there, a lot of the source material in the Warcraft games, like with the first invasion of Azeroth, you know, basically that ends with the orcs succeeding in kind of sacking Stormwind, where Stormwind falls and it forces all the humans to retreat across the sea to Lordaeron, where they form the alliance to resist the forces of the Horde. And in the movie, the orc invasion is actually defeated and Stormwind stands. And I feel like the source material had a much kind of cooler ending to it, where, you know, the humans kind of lose and they're forced to, you know, retreat with their ships. And, you know, their great city kind of falls. And I feel like that might have been like a more fitting ending for the Warcraft movie. Why do you think the filmmakers chose the ending that we got with, you know, King Lane dying and the Horde invasion kind of being stopped and Stormwind standing, as opposed to the, you know, more accurate version from the lore, which could have set up the sequel a little bit better? Why do you think that is, Noble?
I thought about it, and I think it has to do with giving both sides the same ending, be it a victory and a defeat. Whereas on the Horde side, you see Garona all sad as she had to stab the king, and she's all crying about it. But on the other hand, there is the promise of hope, where she can be the beacon to try and bring peace between the Horde and the Alliance. Whereas on the Alliance side, they just lost the king, everybody's sad, but there is this beacon of hope where they are forming the Alliance and they're banding together for their king, for Lane. And I kind of feel that's the reason why they gave us these two endings. Perhaps another reason, but I have no idea about this, would be if they truly bring the Alliance over to Lordaeron and they wanted to give it the same ending, right? Still get the feeling of forming the Alliance of Lordaeron, then they have to create the whole Lordaeron area. And perhaps that didn't fit in the budget for some reason. But that's the only thing I can think of why they went with this ending. You also mentioned that the Horde invasion is defeated. Little bit, like the portal has been shut down, but at the same time, we still have this massive orc force waiting to take over Stormwind and then just carry on the storyline. What do you think, Krip?
They chose to use Warcraft for this, and Warcraft is kind of like a lore that just goes on forever. Like, something happens and something else happens, and then something else happens as a result of that. The characters change, the factions change, there's generations, there's different identities to the roles of, like, you know, the classes that all the characters fit in. There's like surprise bad guys that are, you know, more surprise, even badder guys. It's just, I don't know. I think probably the lead to my comment on this is maybe not what the ending was. It just had to be something. I agree with Noble that it was probably made the way it is, so both Alliance players and Horde players are somewhat equally represented in a way. But yeah, what is the best way to set up a potential sequel? And given what you've mentioned, perhaps this wasn't it. Perhaps there's sequels that are much more compelling to lead into, and what they should have gone with, perhaps the destruction of Stormwind would have done much better, but they had a lot more options than just that, I feel.
I think it's kind of interesting to note that a lot of Warcraft fans were a little bit critical about the choice to choose the first invasion of Azeroth as the purpose of, or as the subject of the film. A lot of people really wanted the Prince Arthas story, which is kind of like, I guess, widely considered the highlight of the Warcraft mythos, in the sense that you have Arthas betraying, the Alliance and kind of creating this new faction with the Lich King and stuff like that, where the Horde and the Alliance have to team up to face the threat. Do you agree with the choice to have the movie focus on the first invasion, or do you think it would have been better to choose a little bit stronger of a tale from the other part of the mythos, like the critics seem to think? Noble?
I think it again goes down to the question, like, were they planning on more movies after this one? And I really feel like they were, considering the title, considering the ending we got. And in that case, I feel like going for the first invasion, it is really at its core the foundation of where Warcraft is built upon. But would I have said like the Lich King storyline would have been better? It could have definitely worked. It all depends, of course, on how it would have been turned out. But to see the Lich King armor on screen and see Arthas follow this whole fall to the dark side and then reawakening as Darth Vader / Lich King, there's definitely an audience for it. Of course, it all depends on how it would be shown and how it would be developed. But for me, I don't mind that they go with the first invasion. I can understand that is like the core at it. I also wouldn't mind seeing the Lich King. Not at all.
Yeah, Kripp, you were kind of most invested in World of Warcraft during the Wrath of the Lich King. What do you think about possibly focusing on that story instead of the first invasion of Azeroth?
So basically, the Arthas / Lich King / Northrend is the best. Now, we talk about a lot of the issues with this movie not having enough time to explain everything and go into really the richness of many of the aspects. And I feel like if they tackled the Arthas storyline as a whole, that would have been way harder. Like you can't even you have to explain why the orcs have beef with the humans even to begin with, to start that story, right? I feel like if they were going to choose the Arthas story, and honestly, I probably think it would have been a better movie, it should have just been like a segment of that story. Perhaps like, maybe just the short lead up and the visit to Northrend itself, rather than having to explain who Arthas is, his role in the world, what is the world. Like in the Arthas storyline, you have to remember it's not even just orcs versus humans. There's so much more crap to explain, right? So I think the Arthas story would have been a better choice, but it couldn't even be the entirety of the Arthas story. It would have to be just a piece for it to work.
All right, guys. So, we've talked about a lot of stuff here, but we're going to wrap this up. And I want to ask you what your final thoughts are on the Warcraft movie. Do you think there should ever be a sequel to it? And what would you like to see in that sequel? Noble?
Final thoughts on the Warcraft movie. Well, we kind of touched upon everything during this interview, which has been great. I would love to see an animated series or something to the side. I don't think that the Warcraft movie is as bad as the critics made it out to be back then. But I also don't think that the Warcraft movie will go down in history as a cinematic masterpiece. Looking at myself, like this has been the second time that I've seen it. I've had the DVD for a couple of years now, and it's just never felt to me like, yeah, let me sit down and watch the Warcraft movie. So that says a lot, because I really like watching movies. Would I like to see a sequel? Sure, why not? If they think that they got the money for it, if they think that they got the product for it, I'll buy tickets for it. I would love to see more of Warcraft on the big screen. It was amazing. So I would go back to the theaters instantly, regardless of weird storylines like You Wanna Lay With Me. I'll laugh through it and look at the pretty Murloc. I wouldn't mind seeing the Arthur storyline. I wouldn't mind seeing more, to be honest.
Kripp, my final thought. What are your final thoughts on the movie, and what would you like to see if there should be a sequel, and where would you like to?
I thought the movie was pretty good. I certainly enjoyed myself. I'd watch even the crappiest of the garbage Warcraft movies that ever came out. I don't really care that much. Just love this genre. I love Warcraft. Yeah, this is my jam. Now, with that said, I think, I hope, like, the way I think about it is like, what's the worst way to follow up this movie? It's literally to just continue it from where it left off. That's the worst thing, because it's too slow, it's too boring, it doesn't really cover all the cool stuff. I think if they did a sequel, it would literally have to be like Thrall Origins. Like, give it the old Star Wars screen. Bunch of shit happened. This is basically the Cliff Notes. Bam, Thrall. Let's see him take on, Durotar and whatnot, and make some friends, and basically relive Warcraft 3. Like, I think that's the way they have to do a sequel. No more of this like balanced stuff that appeases everyone, that introduces too much of everything. I think now that they kind of set the scene, they can quite easily make a more focused movie, and I think that would actually be a lot more successful.
And they did actually set up Thrall's storyline at the end of this movie, so
more or less.
I mean, that's not out of the realm of possibility at all.
Well, it's my comment is like, I don't want to see like the next movie comes out and Thrall is still like 4 weeks old, right? I want to see like Thrall is like, he's getting his little, what are they called, the Frost Wolf? Is it a Frost Wolf? No, he has a Black Wolf that he rides, I believe. Anyway, like teenager Thrall at the very least. Like, just skip a bunch of crap, basically, is my hopefully relevant suggestion.
Yeah, and I think that from the filmmaker's perspective, if they're going to rely on the fans to already know a lot of the lore and stuff going in, why not just jump right to the meatier parts of the Warcraft storyline, and have those adapted for the big screen? I think Kripp is 100% right on that. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like this movie is going to get a sequel. We talked about how it had the subtitle at the beginning in the theater, but on home video, that's actually been removed. It's just Warcraft now. And I think Duncan Jones has gone on record as saying that there are no plans to follow up the movie anytime soon. But it would be interesting to see if Blizzard could somehow ink some type of deal to continue it, because I think a lot of Warcraft fans would like to see a cinematic continuation of this world, or at least something on a streaming service of some type. I think the biggest problem with the Warcraft movie was that it was just okay. Like, visually it was stunning, but the acting and the stories were just, they weren't great, they weren't terrible, they were just kind of like, forgettable. And in a lot of ways, that's even worse than making a bad movie, because at least with a bad movie can be entertaining based off of how bad it is. But a decent movie is just kind of like, whatever. So, I mean, Kripp, do you disagree with that?
I would rather them not make a worse movie than they did.
Oh, totally. But, like, if a movie is really bad, it can be somewhat entertaining, like The Room, for instance.
I didn't find that entertaining. I think if they made a Room-like Warcraft movie, there would be lost jobs in the process.
Probably. Like, we're not advocating for that, but I'm just saying that if you have a really good movie and a really bad movie, those can be their own form of entertaining. But a movie that's just kind of somewhere in the middle, which is what I feel like this Warcraft movie was, it's just kind of like, well, once you're out of the theater, you've forgotten about it, and it's not something that you're dying to revisit and see again. So unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get to see any new Warcraft movies anytime soon, but at least we still have the games to kind of keep us in that world and entertain us for who knows how long to come. All right, guys, thank you so much for coming on this podcast and discussing this movie with us. I really appreciate all your insights, and I would like to give you some time to let the audience know where they can find out more about you. So, Noble, why don't you tell them about your YouTube channel and where they can learn more?
I get to start. Well, thank you very much for having me. This has been a ton of fun. You can find me on the YouTube. Just look up under Nobbel, or Twitch, or Twitter, or Facebook, or Instagram, all across the internet. If you're down with Warcraft lore and you like my voice and you want me to tell you the story of Arthas and the Lich King, I got like a 3-hour video up. You don't even have to go to the theaters. I got you on YouTube. You could check it out. But yeah, thank you very much for having me, and take it over.
Well, thank you for coming. I can tell you that Nobbel has, it's almost like a documentary series watching his channel. It's kind of like watching the History Channel, but for a completely made up world. It's fascinating. And I love every time he puts out a new video, I'll sit there and I'll watch it and learn all types of wonderful things about the Warcraft universe. And now, Kripp, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about where they can find out more about you?
So I'm mostly like a game player. I play just about every Blizzard game except Overwatch, I guess. And yeah, I love me some Warcraft. I play Hearthstone, which is the Warcraft-based card game. I'm playing that for a long time, and I fell in love with the game largely because of its ties to Warcraft. Just a little bit of Warcraft splashed into anything is a good thing. And you'll certainly get that splash if you check out my nightly streams or the daily YouTube videos my wife puts out. So check them out. Kripparrian, Kripp, everywhere on the internet. That's us.
Yeah, Kripp has a very interesting Instagram account if you ever want to follow him on there. And I don't know how he puts out 2 videos a day, but he seems to be able to do that on a pretty regular basis. And they're all very educational, especially if you like to play Hearthstone like I do. And but mostly his daily streams. Kripp, I don't know how you keep up with your schedule because it's crazy how much time you put into the stuff. But his nightly streams are very entertaining as well. It's almost like talk radio where he'll give you commentary as he's playing these games. And it's always very insightful and entertaining, in my opinion. So definitely check out Nobbel and Kripp. And thank you guys for coming and checking out our little discussion on Warcraft. And I'll see you in the next episode. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the video. Please check us out on our socials. You can find us on Facebook at eggfbgroup.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Matthew Kadish, Kadish. You can find us on Instagram at Matthew Kadish as well. You can also find us on Patreon. Support us by going to www.kadishdonate.com and subscribe to us on YouTube at kadishvideo.com. We update our channel regularly. Finally, check us out on Amazon at kadishbooks.com, Kadish books.com. Thank you all for tuning in. This is Matthew Kadish, and I will catch you later.